as I was saying, is marking the 20th anniversary of the genocide in which at least 800,000 people were killed, mainly ethnic Tutsis and moderate Hutus, in the space of just 100 days. France 24 correspondent Nicolas Germain has been to the western town of Karongi, where one of the worst massacres took place. Let's hear now the incredible stories of those who saw firsthand what happened there.
On the banks of Lake Kivu, the town of Karongi, which used to be called Kibuye, an idyllic setting. Yet it's here that one of the worst events of the genocide took place. In this church, several thousand people were slaughtered in just one day. Like elsewhere in Rwanda, the Tutsis had decided to gather around the church. Among them was Madeleine Mukaremera.
The women and children would collect stones, and the young men among us would then throw them at our attackers. This situation lasted for 3 days. Then, on April 17th, the Hutus launched their major attack. They killed our young men and women. There were bodies lying everywhere. That's when the old women and the children went inside the church.
On April the 17th, Alexis de Gigimana also sought refuge in the Saint-Jean church.
Here, there were a lot of bodies in pieces because they threw grenades inside. Everyone was yelling. Bodies were lying on top of one another.
Those who still could then fled 500 meters away to the Home Saint-Jean hotel, but they were quickly chased down by their killers. This former prisoner says he and his comrades had no mercy.
Our leaders said we had to kill all the cockroaches. He meant the Tutsis. He said, take your machetes, take your weapons, and find the Tutsis and kill them. One group went to the church. The other one came to this hotel. I was here. We found many Tutsis and we started to kill them with our machetes.
But a few Tutsis managed to hide in the hotel's laundry room.
Suddenly, a baby started to cry. A woman quickly put her hand over his mouth. That's when I also saw that my husband was hiding here. After the baby cried, the militiamen who were on their way out decided to come back. They told us to come out one by one and started killing people with machetes and clubs.
The militiamen spared Madeleine and 15 others to interrogate them. On the way to the police station, one soldier took pity on them and allowed them to flee. They hid in the hills until the end of the genocide. That soldier was not the only Hutu who helped Tutsis in Karongi. Josephine Dusabimana is one of them.
That's a reward I received from the government of the United States because I hid some Tutsis who would have otherwise been executed.
6 times over the 100 days of the genocide, Josephine hid Tutsis in this cramped room.
I just thought it was normal to do this because these innocent people were going to be killed. I thought all those who came here must live, and if they had to die, I would die with them.
Victim support groups estimate that in all, several hundred Hutu men and women across Rwanda put themselves in mortal danger by hiding their Tutsi compatriots in their homes.
Now, for more on the Rwandan genocide, I'm now joined on set by Michael Kirtley. He's the producer of the World Memory Film Project. Hello, thank you very much for coming in.
Nice to.
Now, could you start off by telling us about your project? What is its goal?
Well, it starts out from the point of view that genocide belongs to all of us. We have to take heart at what's happened in Rwanda and many other places around the world where such atrocities have taken place, and say that this is somehow related to us, because we're all capable. I mean, we've seen, it's not just in Africa, but we've seen in Europe, we've seen in Asia, we've seen in South America, such atrocities take place. And the World Memory Film Project starts from also the other point of view, which is to say that the youth of the world needs to be educated and needs to have a voice in how the future is going to take place, because we also notice that institutions and countries have not been able to solve much of this. I mean, since 1994, we've seen just as many atrocities that have taken place, despite the United Nations declaring that there's a responsibility to protect, despite the fact that lots of hand washing on the part of the United States and Belgium and France about Rwanda. essentially you still have situations where these kinds of atrocities take place all over the world.
So you get people to talk about their experiences.
Not just their experiences, but also their emotional reactions.
And how does that help prevent future atrocities?
Well, I think that the first thing before, most people when they hear the word genocide, they turn their heads. They say, I don't want to talk about that, I don't want. But when you actually think about what your reactions are, you start actually realizing that there's a positive expression. You start saying to yourself, well, maybe I can relate to the people that could be living today if there had not been the genocide. So we find that lots of young people that are getting involved, they say this is one of the most positive experiences that they've had in their lives because they think that they can actually do something. Then, of course, another part of this is the numbers. In other words, we're reaching out to countries all over the world. So when you reach hundreds of thousands of people and maybe even millions of people like we're hoping, then you create a movement. And that movement has great influence. And that's the end goal of the World Memory Film Project. For example, I was in the United Nations recently with the head of the Genocide Prevention Unit. His name is Adam Majing. He's the special advisor to Ban Ki-moon for genocide prevention. And he said that today you get lots of institutions such as Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, others who come in with their problems to talk about, and that's normal. They want to listen to them, but they also have received letters coming from universities, from young people in California or wherever, and they said that as soon as they receive something directly from people, especially from young people, they actually want to do something differently because they don't ask themselves, what's the agenda, what's the political purpose of they realize it's coming directly from future leaders. So I think that there's a huge missing part in this whole discussion, and that is, how do we feel about hatred? How do we feel about education? How do we feel about the ability to change people's minds? And I think that it's that feeling that's a very important starting point. If we don't go there, then how can we intellectually decide to end atrocity?
And how can we get people who perhaps don't feel much when they hear about commemorations like this 20 years on from the genocide? Obviously people are watching programs like ours around the world, but is it very important for people who aren't directly affected to still feel affected in some way by what happened?
I think it's extremely important if it's not important because of seeing human suffering, it's important by seeing the world's loss. When I think about the Holocaust, or when I think about Rwanda, or when I think about what's been going on in Darfur, I think of the losses of potential treasures that existed among those populations to bring something beautiful into the world. And so if we're not thinking about simply the humanitarian aspect, which many people feel is a negative duty, so to speak, they feel it's not my responsibility, at least think about what we're missing. I think that this is how we have, through the World Memory Film Project, been able to attract people that before said they never wanted to think about genocide.
And having spoken to a lot of people now, do you think there are lessons that can be drawn and that there are things that people have in common in different conflicts?
Yes, I think the number one lesson is, how do we see the other? I think things have changed a lot since Rwanda, and since, in the sense that thanks to social media, we're not thinking of who we're speaking through social media as an Asian or as an African or as a black or a yellow or white person. We're thinking them as a person that has something interesting to exchange with me. So that's a beginning, is to see the other person as simply the value that they represent in your life and not as a competitor of some sort. So yes, I think that the starting point for change is an education about how do other count count in my life in a positive way? And then taking that education to really difficult parts of the world. Because obviously in the Western world today, we're not thinking about killing each other simply because we're fearing competition. That doesn't happen very often. But in places like Rwanda, where the population was so dense and the economy was kind of weak before, or in other places where you feel a lot of pressure, whether that be land grabbing or water resources or things, then you start thinking, well, maybe if I got rid of this other person, that somehow that would help my situation. I think that in educating those populations, and we're working a lot about that, we're going directly to young people in those countries involved, in Africa, in the Arab world, in Asia, and we're asking for their opinions and their voice in how they look upon the others. And I think that when you start doing it that way, then you incrementally increase the ability to fight against the voices of negativity about those people.
And what do you make of the situation in Rwanda now, of reconciliation efforts there?
Well, I think that, as we saw in the documentary, you have. I think when you're talking about reconciliation, you're always talking about a political stance as well. You're not just talking about some kumbaya moment. You're talking about somehow trying to govern a country and see whether. I do think that the government of Rwanda has done a pretty good job in pulling the country out of the aftermath of genocide, partly because they've been willing to analyze it and focus on what people did and what people can do to come out of it. But in my opinion, the bigger question is, what are the lessons we can learn from the aftermath of Rwanda? And when I look at the world, as a good friend of mine, Mukesh Kapila, who was one of the witnesses of Rwanda, once said, there's no genocide that's called a genocide until after it's taken place. And so how do you start predicting? How do you see the xenophobia that arises before a genocide? And then how do you decide to do something about it? And I think that in the Rwandan case, there are too many political influences that the government of Rwanda has put onto the Rwandan aftermath to really declare that they're a good example to follow.
And very briefly, is there one happening right now? Laurent Fabius said that in the Central African Republic, it was on the verge of genocide. Would you say that's accurate?
I would say the Central African Republic is definitely a pre-genocidal situation, because let's not forget that Rwanda didn't begin in 1994. It began partly because of the Belgian colonization. It began certainly in 1990 with a lot of the different jockeying for positions between the Tutsis and the Hutus there. So I think in looking at the Central African Republic as a pre-genocidal situation, of course it is. Of course it is, because there is now a mindset in the Central African people that says that you can resolve problems through killing. I mean, now the reactionaries, the Christian reactionaries to the Seleka sort of taking over the country in Central African Republic, has led the Christians to believe that this is what you do. You get rid of the Muslims and you have peace. Of course, that's not true, because once you've done that, then you start thinking of other victims.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael Kirtley, for coming into France 24. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. We'll be back shortly, though, with another news update at the top of the hour. Do stay tuned.